All right, strap in, everyone, because we are going deep on some must-know cloud security concepts.
Yeah, especially if you're gearing up for the ISC2 CCSP exam.
You know it. We get it. Studying for these certifications can feel like you're drinking from a fire hose.
Absolutely. There's just so much information.
So we're here to help you cut through the noise and zero in on what really matters, the stuff that's going to make a difference on exam day.
That's right. Think of this as your CCSP cheat sheet.
Okay, so let's kick things off with a real-world scenario that I think highlights the crazy world of cloud security and jurisdiction.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Imagine this. Your company is based in sunny California,
All right.
but you've got customers all the way over in New York,
Okay.
and your cloud provider, they're down in Texas.
Gotcha.
Oh, and just to spice things up, they might be storing your data in Florida.
Wow, talk about a jurisdictional nightmare. Whose laws apply in a situation like that?
Right. It's enough to make your head spin.
And it gets even more complex when you bring international laws into the mix.
Oh, absolutely. I'm thinking like GDPR.
Exactly, the EU's General Data Protection Regulation.
Huge. So what does GDPR say?
Basically, it says if you're dealing with personal data from EU residents, their rules apply.
No matter what.
No matter where that data is physically located, even if it's sitting on a server in, say, Iowa.
Whoa, that's a big deal for anyone working with cloud services.
It is. And it highlights why a global perspective on data protection is non-negotiable, especially for the CCSP exam.
So bottom line for our listeners prepping for the CCSP, don't get tunnel vision on just U.S. laws.
You got it. Broaden your horizons, think globally when it comes to data protection.
Now let's zoom in on data privacy itself.
Okay, love it.
Put yourself in the shoes of someone responsible for a company's data. What keeps you up at night?
I'd say the top priorities have got to be protecting PII and PHI.
Okay, spell those out for us.
So PII, that's personally identifiable information.
Right.
Anything that can be linked back to a specific person, think
Uh-oh.
names, addresses, social security numbers, you name it. And then there's PHI, protected health information.
The stuff covered under high pay.
Bingo.
Okay.
All those sensitive healthcare records.
High pay, it's everywhere in cloud security.
For good reason. And remember, it's not just about privacy either. iPay has a strong security component as well.
Right, got to keep that data safe and sound.
Absolutely. Now, when it comes to building a solid data privacy program, you really can't go wrong with the generally accepted privacy principles, or GAP.
Okay, I like to think of them as the 10 commandments of data privacy, kind of a blueprint for doing things right.
That's a great way to put it. They build on each other and cover a lot of ground.
So let's walk through those 10 principles, shall we? First up, management.
Right. It's all about establishing clear roles and responsibilities.
So we know who's steering the ship.
Right, exactly. You need a data owner, a steward, a custodian. Everyone has their part to play.
Okay, so we've got our team in place. What's next?
Notice, all about transparency.
So, no hiding in the shadows.
Nope. Users need to know what data you're collecting and how you plan to use it.
Think those website privacy policies we all love to read?
Exactly. Although, let's be honest, who actually reads those things?
Fair point. All right, next up is choice and consent.
Super important, especially in the context of GDPR.
So users need to have a say in how their data is used.
Absolutely. And they need to be able to opt out if they're not comfortable.
It's all about control, putting users in the driver's seat.
You got it. Now, principle number 4, collection.
Oh, this is a big one. Don't be a data hoarder, right?
Exactly. Only collect what you absolutely need for the stated purpose.
No need to build a data mountain just because you can.
Right. And once you've collected it, you need to think about principle number 5, use, retention, and disposal.
Okay, so what happens to the data once we have it?
Well, you use it for its intended purpose, keep it as long as you need it, and then dispose of it securely.
No lingering data zombies hanging around.
Nope. Get rid of it when you're done and do it safely.
And don't forget about access, principle number 6.
Right. Individuals should be able to see and correct their own information.
Transparency and user control. Key themes here.
Absolutely. Then we have disclosure to third parties, principle number 7.
Another big one for the CCSP exam.
Definitely. Be upfront about who you're sharing data with and get consent before you do it.
No sneaky data, deals behind closed doors.
Nope. Transparency is key. Speaking of key, principle number 8, security.
This one's a no-brainer, right? Protect that data like it's Fort Knox.
You got it. Implement those strong security controls, encryption, access controls, the whole 9 yards.
Keep those bad guys out. All right, on to principle number 9, quality.
Right. Make sure that data is accurate and reliable.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. And finally, principle number 10, monitoring and enforcement.
Got to make sure we're actually following all these principles, right?
Absolutely, and that we have a system in place to handle any disputes or issues that arise.
Okay, so those are the generally accepted privacy principles.
10 essential guidelines for building a strong privacy foundation.
And they're really not that scary, are they?
Nope, just common sense, really.
But remember, they are crucial for the CCSP exam.
Oh, yeah. You might get questions that ask you to apply these principles to real-world scenarios.
So now that we've got a handle on data privacy principles, let's talk about the legal ramifications of not following them.
Oh, yeah. The stakes can get pretty high when it comes to data protection.
Absolutely. And here in the U.S., we have this kind of crazy quilt of laws.
It can be a bit overwhelming to keep track of them all, for sure.
But we're going to break it down for you. Let's start with the big one, HIPAA.
The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act.
Protecting all that sensitive healthcare information.
And don't forget about the HITECH Act, which really beefed up HIPAA's security and breach notification requirements.
Right, so if you're working in healthcare or handling any kind of health data.
HIPAA and HITECH, you got to know them inside and out.
And what about all those student educational records? Those are protected too, right?
You bet. That's where FERPA comes in.
The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act.
Exactly. Gives students and parents some serious rights when it comes to their educational records.
Another crucial one to remember for the CCSP exam.
Definitely. Now, let's shift gears to the financial world.
Oh, yeah, they've got their own set of regulations, right?
You know it. That's GLBA, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act.
And what does GLBA cover?
Financial institutions, mainly, mandates things like written security programs, having individuals responsible for information security.
Okay, so we've got HAPA for healthcare, FERPA for education, GLBA for finance. What about kids' data when we're talking about the online world?
Ah, that's where COPA steps in, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act.
What's the gist of COPA?
It sets the rules for how websites and online services can collect and use data from kids under 13.
So if you're building an app or website for kids, COPA is your new best friend.
Absolutely. Now, here's one that trips people up all the time. The Privacy Act of 1974.
Yeah, it sounds super broad, like it applies to everyone.
You'd think so, right? But there's a catch. It only applies to federal agencies.
Really?
Yeah, not private organizations. So watch out for that on the exam.
It's a bit of a trick question, huh?
Kind of. Now, while the U.S. takes this patchwork approach to data privacy,
Right. Different laws for different sectors.
other countries have a broader, more comprehensive view.
Thinking GDPR again.
You got it. It's a prime example of how international laws can have a ripple effect on your organization's cloud strategy.
GDPR, it's got global reach.
Absolutely. It covers EU residence data no matter where it's processed or stored.
So you can't just assume that if your data is sitting on a server in the U.S., you're in the clear.
Nope. You've got to think globally when it comes to data privacy.
And on that global note, what about Canada?
They have their own federal privacy law, too, PIPEDA.
Okay, and what does PIPEDA focus on?
It governs how businesses use personal information.
So another one to keep in mind.
Definitely. And then there's APEC's Cross-Border Privacy Rules System, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. It's a voluntary framework, but it helps businesses transfer personal data across borders while still respecting privacy principles.
Kind of like a global handshake on data privacy.
That's a great way to put it. It shows that data privacy is becoming a global concern, and international cooperation is more important than ever.
All right, so we've covered a ton of ground on data privacy laws and regulations. Ready to take it up a notch.
I'm always up for a challenge. What's next?
Let's dive into specialized compliance issues. Think about taking all this knowledge and applying it to specific industries and real-world situations.
Okay, sounds interesting. Let's do it.
So you've got these older regulations trying to keep up with the cloud.
Right, trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
And then you have newer regulations written specifically with the cloud in mind.
It's a dynamic landscape, that's for sure.
It is. Let's start with SOP again.
Okay, so not just privacy this time.
Right. This time we're talking about those security requirements that can be tricky to navigate in the cloud.
Oh, yeah, like how do you ensure the confidentiality and integrity of PHI when it's floating around in the cloud?
Exactly. It's not as straightforward as locking it up in a filing cabinet.
Nope. And then there's GDPR again,
What about it this time?
those regulatory transparency requirements.
So they basically want to peek under the hood and see what's going on in your cloud operations.
Precisely. Making sure you're handling data responsibly, following all the rules.
And let's not forget about SOX.
Ah, SOX, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act.
All about financial reporting and accountability.
Right. Applies to publicly traded companies, making sure those financial records are accurate, even when they're in the cloud.
Makes sense. Now, it's not always about government regulations, is it?
Nope. Sometimes industries decide to self-regulate, set their own standards.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
A great example is PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard.
So that's all about protecting credit card data.
Exactly. Globally recognized set of rules that every organization handling credit cards needs to follow.
Okay, so PCI DSS for credit cards. What else?
Then there's NURC-CIP, focused on protecting the electric grid.
Whoa, that's a big one. Talk about critical infrastructure.
No kidding. Imagine the chaos if the power grid went down because of a cyber attack.
Yeah, not a good scenario. So as you can see, there's this whole universe of compliance requirements out there.
Some from the government, some from industry groups.
And it's essential to know which ones apply to your organization and your cloud environment.
Absolutely. It's part of the challenge, but also part of what makes cloud security so interesting.
It's like a giant puzzle, figuring out how to make it all work together.
Exactly. And speaking of challenges, let's talk about data breaches.
Oh yeah, everyone's worst nightmare.
No kidding. Imagine your company's data just out there, compromised.
Reputational damage, identity theft, fines, stolen intellectual property. The consequences are huge.
They are. So let's say a breach happens. What's the first thing an information security professional should do?
Well, I'd imagine you'd need to escalate it, right?
Absolutely. Get senior management involved immediately.
This is not a solo mission.
Definitely not. You need all hands on deck.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you've got to investigate what happened.
Like a digital detective.
Exactly. Figure out how the breach occurred, what data was accessed, you name it.
Okay, so you've escalated, you're investigating what's next.
Containment. Stop the bleeding, so to speak.
Shut down systems, isolate accounts, maybe even take the whole network offline if you have to.
Sometimes that's what it takes to minimize the damage.
Drastic, but necessary in some cases.
Definitely. And then, of course, there's the notification part.
Ah, yes, those data breach notification laws.
The fun part, right?
And didn't we talk about how those vary from state to state?
We did. It's a real headache for organizations operating across multiple states.
So any tips for our CCSP studies out there on how to stay on top of all these different laws?
A great resource is the National Conference of State Legislatures website.
Okay, I'm taking notes.
They've got a chart that links to each state's specific breach notification laws.
Bookmark that one, folks. It could save you a lot of hassle.
Absolutely. And while you're at it, remember that encryption can be your best friend in a data breach situation.
Oh, how so?
Because a lot of times, if data is encrypted, it's exempt from notification requirements.
So encryption's like a get-out-of-jail-free card.
In a way, yeah. If you can encrypt your data, do it. It could save you a lot of headaches down the road.
Okay, noted. Encryption is good.
Yeah.
Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about e-discovery.
The legal side of things.
Right. Imagine your company gets sued.
Uh-oh.
And you need to provide all your electronic records, emails, documents, the whole shebang.
Sounds like a lawyer's dream.
And a security professional's nightmare.
Wow.
So that's where e-discovery comes in, right?
Exactly. It's all about managing and preserving electronic evidence in a way that holds up in court.
So like a digital filing cabinet for legal cases?
That's a good analogy. And there are 3 key phases to e-discovery: preservation, collection, and production.
Okay, let's break those down. What exactly happens in each phase?
Well, preservation is all about making sure you don't accidentally delete or modify any data that might be relevant to the case.
So like hitting the pause button on your digital spring cleaning.
Exactly. Then there's collection, where you actually gather the data from all those different sources, servers, email systems, cloud storage, mobile devices, the whole works.
That sounds like a massive undertaking.
It can be. And finally, you have production, where you prep the data for review by the opposing counsel. This might involve converting it to a specific format, redacting confidential information, creating summaries, things like that.
So production is all about getting the data ready for prime time.
You got it. And it's a crucial step in the e-discovery process.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
From data breaches and e-discovery to encryption and those ever-important breach notification laws.
It's a lot to take in, but it's all essential for anyone working in cloud security, especially those preparing for the CCSP exam.
Absolutely. We'll take a short break now and come back for part 2, where we'll explore even more must-know concepts to help you ace that exam.
Sounds good. See you soon. Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive.
All right, I'm ready for more cloud security goodness.
Okay, good, because we're about to lay down a solid foundation of cloud security concepts and architectures.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So you can think of this as the blueprint for building a secure and resilient cloud environment.
Got it.
And trust me, this stuff isn't just important for passing the CCSP exam.
Oh, I believe it.
It's fundamental to a successful career in cloud security, period.
Noted. So what's our first building block?
Let's start with a classic, the CIA triad.
CIA. Are we talking spies and espionage now?
Not quite. Although sometimes it can feel like that with all the threats out there in the cloud.
True. Okay, so CIA and cloud security, what's it all about?
In this context, CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability.
Ah, yes, the famous CIA triad. Honestly, though, I hear these terms so much, they kind of lose their meaning sometimes.
I get it, they're almost like buzzwords.
Right. So can you remind me why they're so crucial, especially when we're talking about cloud security?
Absolutely. Let's start with confidentiality. That's all about protecting sensitive information from unauthorized access.
Okay, so keeping those prying eyes away from the data.
Exactly. We're talking encryption, access controls, need to know, all that good stuff.
So, like having a vault for your data and being super careful about who gets the keys?
That's a great analogy. Now, integrity is all about making sure the data stays accurate and unaltered.
Okay, so no tampering allowed.
Right. Think tamper-proof seals, checksums, change management, making sure no one's messing with the data.
Gotcha. So confidentiality is about protecting access. Integrity is about protecting the accuracy of the data.
You got it. Now, the last piece of the puzzle, availability.
Ah, yes, availability. What's that all about?
Availability means making sure systems and data are accessible to authorized users whenever they need them.
Okay, so like no downtime.
Right. We want to make sure your cloud services are always up and running, even if something goes wrong.
Makes sense. So that means things like redundancy, disaster recovery plans, all that jazz.
You got it. It's all about minimizing downtime and ensuring business continuity.
Got it. So we've got the CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, availability.
3 pillars of information security.
Now, how does this play out in the cloud, where we've got this whole shared responsibility thing going on?
Ah, yes. Shared responsibility. That's where things can get a little tricky.
I've always found it a bit confusing, to be honest.
I hear you. It's like, where does the provider's responsibility end and yours begin?
Exactly.
Well, it all depends on the cloud service model you're using.
Okay, remind me, what are those models again?
So we've got IDSS, infrastructure as a service, PaaS, platform as a service, and SaaS, software as a service.
Right, right. So how does this shared responsibility change based on the model?
Think of it this way. The more control you have, the more responsibility you have.
Okay, interesting.
So in IARIS, you have a lot of control over the underlying infrastructure, like virtual machines, networks, storage,
Yeah.
which means you've got more security responsibilities too.
Makes sense.
But with SaaS, the provider handles most of that stuff, so your responsibilities are more focused on things like user access and data protection.
Got it. So less control, less responsibility.
Pretty much. And knowing these distinctions is critical for the CCSP exam because they love to throw in questions about who's responsible for what in different cloud scenarios.
Okay, good to know. I'll make sure to study up on those shared responsibility models.
Definitely do that. Now, let's move on to another important concept, defense in depth.
Okay, defense in depth. Isn't that just a fancy way of saying layering your security?
Haha. Well, kind of. But it's a bit more nuanced than that.
Oh, I'm listening.
Think of it as creating multiple layers of security, like the layers of an onion, so that even if one layer is breached, the attacker still has to get through the others.
So even if they get past the outer layer, they're not home free.
Right. Exactly. It's about making it as difficult as possible for them to penetrate your defenses.
Okay, I like that. Can you give me a real-world example of how this actually works in the cloud?
Sure. Let's say you're building a web application in AWS. You could implement defense in depth by using security groups to control traffic at the virtual machine level.
Okay.
Then you could add network access control lists, or ACLs, to filter traffic at the subnet level.
Another layer.
Right, and then on top of that, you could implement a web application firewall, or WAF, to protect against attacks at the application layer.
So it's like having multiple checkpoints at each level, each with its own set of security rules and protections.
You got it. And that's just one example. You can apply this principle to all sorts of cloud environments and services.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. Defense in depth, layered security.
Exactly. Now, closely related to that is the principle of least privilege.
Okay, I remember this one. Something about giving users the bare minimum permissions they need, right?
Yeah. Exactly. It's all about minimizing the potential damage if an account is compromised.
Makes sense, especially in the cloud where everything is interconnected.
Right. So if a user only needs to read data from a database, they shouldn't have permission to write or delete data.
Gotcha. And if a system only needs to access certain cloud resources, it shouldn't have access to the entire environment.
Precisely. It's about compartmentalizing access and limiting the blast radius if something goes wrong.
Okay, so defense, in-depth, and least privilege, two key concepts for building a secure cloud architecture.
Absolutely. Now let's zoom out a bit and talk about cloud security domains.
Cloud security domains.
Think of them as the different areas we need to focus on to secure our cloud environments, like different departments in a security organization.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm.
What are some of these key domains?
Well, we have application security, data security, identity and access management, infrastructure security, and incident response.
Wow, that's a lot of ground to cover.
It is, but these are the essential pillars of a secure cloud strategy.
Got it. So let's break these down one by one, starting with application security. Why is that so important in the cloud?
Well, think about all the applications we're moving to the cloud these days.
Right, tons of web apps, mobile apps, all sorts of stuff.
Exactly. And all those applications are potential targets for attackers.
Especially in the cloud, where they're often exposed to the internet.
Right. So we need to make sure they're secure from the ground up.
And with the rise of microservices and serverless computing, it's getting even more complex, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. We're breaking down applications into smaller and smaller components, which means there are more attack surfaces to protect.
Makes sense. So what about data security? That seems like a pretty big deal too.
It's huge. We're talking to protecting data at rest, in transit, and in use.
Okay, so no matter where the data is, we need to keep it safe.
Exactly. We're talking encryption, access controls, data loss prevention, the whole 9 yards.
Because data is the crown jewel, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's what attackers are really after.
Absolutely. And now, closely tied to data security is identity and access management, or IAM.
Ah, yes, IAM. Another one of those acronyms that gets thrown around a lot.
I know, right? But it's a super important concept.
So break it down for me. What's IAM all about?
It's about managing user identities and controlling who has access to what in the cloud environment.
Okay, so like who's allowed to do what?
Exactly. We're talking strong authentication, authorization policies, single sign-on, identity federation.
So it's like having a bouncer at the door, making sure only the right people get in.
Perfect analogy. And it's crucial in the cloud because we've got users accessing resources from all over the place.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. Now, what about the last two domains? Infrastructure security and incident response.
Okay, so infrastructure security is all about securing the physical infrastructure of the cloud.
Okay, so like the data centers, the servers, all that.
Exactly. Think physical security controls, network security, system hardening, vulnerability management.
Got it. And incident response, what's that about?
That's all about having a plan in place for when things go wrong.
Because let's face it, no matter how secure your cloud environment is, there's always a chance something could happen.
Absolutely. So you need to be prepared to detect those incidents, contain them, eradicate them, recover from them, and learn from them.
It's like having a fire drill for your cloud environment.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, I think I'm getting a much better grasp on these cloud security domains.
Good. It's like having a roadmap for building a secure cloud strategy.
And it's a lot to think about. But I'm ready to move beyond the concepts and get into the nitty-gritty of how we actually make this stuff happen.
All right, I like your enthusiasm. That's what we'll be tackling in the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're in the home stretch now, the final part of our cloud security deep dive.
That's right, we've covered a ton of ground already, from legal and compliance stuff to security architectures and all those important domains.
But now we're shifting gears, getting into the operational side of things.
Yeah, the day-to-day grind of keeping your cloud environment secure and compliant.
Sounds like a lot to juggle. Where do we even begin?
Well, it all starts with risk management. That's really the foundation.
Okay, risk management. Sounds simple enough, but how do you actually do it, like in real life?
First things first. You gotta know what you're protecting, right?
Right.
What are your most valuable assets in the cloud? What are those crown jewels that attackers are gonna be after?
Okay, so we've got our crown jewels identified. Then what?
Then you gotta figure out what those threats are, what could potentially harm those assets.
Okay, so threats then.
And vulnerabilities too, right?
Right.
What are the weaknesses in your systems that those threats could exploit?
So it's like a risk assessment, figuring out where you're most vulnerable.
Exactly. And once you've got a handle on those risks, you got to assess them, prioritize them.
Okay, how do you do that?
Think about how likely they are to actually happen and what the impact would be if they did.
So some risks are more serious than others.
Right. It's like a triage system. You focus on the most dangerous ones first.
Gotcha. So we've assessed the risks. Now what?
Well, you've got 4 basic options.
Wow.
Avoid, transfer, mitigate, or accept.
Okay, 4 options. Break those down for me.
So avoiding risk, that's basically saying, nope, too risky, I'm not doing that.
Like, just don't use that cloud service at all.
Exactly. If you're really worried about the security of something, sometimes the best option is to avoid it altogether.
Okay, that makes sense. What about transferring risk?
That's like passing the buck, but in a responsible way.
Okay, how do you do that?
Think insurance, right? You buy cyber insurance to cover the costs if something bad happens, like a data breach.
Ah, so you're not eliminating the risk, you're just shifting the financial burden.
Exactly. Now, mitigating risk, that's where you're actually taking steps to reduce the likelihood or the impact of a threat.
Okay, so that's where we get into the actual security stuff.
Right. Think encryption, firewalls, intrusion detection systems, all those security controls we've been talking about.
So you're not just hoping for the best. You're actively trying to prevent bad things from happening.
You got it. And then there's accepting risk.
Accepting risk. What does that mean?
It means acknowledging that the risk exists, but deciding not to take any action.
Why would you ever do that?
Well, sometimes the cost of mitigating the risk is just too high compared to the potential impact.
So you're basically saying it's a risk I'm willing to take.
Exactly. It's a calculated decision based on a cost-benefit analysis.
Okay, I get it. So we've got a risk management plan in place. How do we know if it's actually working?
That's where security assessments and auditing come in.
Okay, 2 different things, right?
Right. Security assessments are more about evaluating the effectiveness of your security controls.
Okay, so like a checkup to make sure everything's working as it should.
Exactly. And you can do these internally, or you can bring in an outside auditor for an independent perspective.
Got it. So what about auditing? How's that different?
Auditing is more focused on compliance, making sure you're meeting all those regulatory requirements.
Ah, so it's about making sure you're following all the rules and checking all the boxes.
Precisely. Now, let's talk about some of the tools and techniques that can help you with these operational tasks.
Okay, I'm ready for some practical tips.
All right. First up, we have vulnerability scanning.
Vulnerability scanning, what's that all about?
It's an automated process that identifies known vulnerabilities in your systems and applications.
So it's like a security robot that crawls around looking for weaknesses.
That's a great analogy. And once you found those vulnerabilities, you got to patch them up.
Patching.
Yeah, patching is the process of applying updates to fix those vulnerabilities, kind of like getting your software vaccinated.
So patching is good. Keep those updates coming. What else?
Log management is another big one.
Log management. I've heard of that, but I'm not sure I totally get it.
It's all about keeping track of what's happening in your cloud environment.
Okay, so like a security camera that's recording everything.
Exactly. But it can be a bit overwhelming with so much data being generated.
Yeah, I bet. How do you manage all those logs?
Well, that's where centralized log management systems come in.
Ah, so you can collect all that data in one place and make sense of it.
Right. It's like having a security control room where you can monitor all the activity.
Okay, I'm liking this. So vulnerability scanning, patching, log management, anything else?
Don't forget about the human factor.
Ah, yes, the human factor. People can be the weakest link, right?
Sometimes. So security awareness training is really important.
Okay, training, so teaching people about security best practices.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, security is everyone's responsibility, not just the IT team.
So true. Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into cloud security.
We covered a lot of ground. I hope our listeners are feeling more confident about tackling those cloud security challenges, especially if they're prepping for the CCSP exam.
Me too. But remember, this is an ongoing journey.
Absolutely. Cloud security is constantly evolving, so you got to stay curious, keep learning, and never stop asking questions.
Couldn't agree more. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to like, subscribe, and tell your friends. We'll be back with more fascinating cloud security insights.
See you next time.